Walter Tevis's first two books, The Hustler and Man Who Fell to Earth, have only become well known because of the films. The later books, which in my opinion are quite superior as books, which have not been filmed, are languishing as remainders or on shelves or nowhere, and it's a shame. There are certainly two books which I would regard as really important American novels. One is The Queen's Gambit, about a little girl who goes to Russia to become a Grand Master at the age of 9. And the other is Steps to the Sun, which is a science fiction novel. So it's really very difficult to classify him, and you know what happens to people you can't classify. They dive. And I think that's what's happened. But in terms of ideas for books, I think many of them are wonderful. It's just that they don't fit a category. And maybe that's what happened with the film, that it didn't do well, partly because it was said to be incomprehensible, one, but I think primarily because it doesn't have a genre. And that is difficult. I mean, there have been films without genre that have done well, but this really did not have one and was not meant to. And Nick Roeg sent me The Man Who Fell to Earth. I think it was in 1974 or 75. And what struck me was that this was not a conventional science fiction novel. In other words, this was not, although it vaguely resembled, Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. There was no hard science fiction machinery or hardware or any of that stuff. So it seemed to me that it was a book by a writer who was using a science fiction premise, that's to say the alien visiting Earth, as a pretext for something else, a pretext for a look at the United States at that time. So we took that idea, or that notion of what Tevis was after, and presented the film largely visually, I have to say, but in a sense that you are seeing the Earth, the United States, from an alien's point of view. And although he stays many years, in fact, he's still looking at it and finds everything difficult to understand how it works. So that we were less concerned with where he came from, or even why he was here, than the way someone from another planet would view ours. The book was published in 1963. It had been optioned. It was envisaged, as I understand it, as a series, television series, like The Fugitive. Like, you've got to catch this alien before he strikes again. Each week, the alien comes back, he got away, each time. Which wasn't a stupid idea. I mean, that would come out of the book. And then it just lapsed because nobody could lick it. And I think it's hard to lick because you can't really do the book. You just can't. There isn't the money to do what's in the book, and he's not a hero, he doesn't have a gun in his hand, he doesn't have a ray gun or anything, So I don't know whether Nick was the only person who could have done it, but it was a way of thinking about it that took what I would regard as certainly an essence of the book. Not all of it, but a big, big part of it, and made it into a film language. Somewhere in the back of my mind was this idea that why does science fiction always have to be so unemotional? So what I wanted to do was to take an emotional story with a science fiction background, which made the love story and the involvement and friendship and betrayal and so forth, all of the things that are human, but in the knowledge that there was a background from somewhere out of space. And that was really our starting point. Tevis is a man who was drawn to symbols. When Newton comes to Farnsworth's apartment in New York the first time, I think he sees a statue which is like a statue of Christ. There were a number of references to Jesus returned. There were also other things. There was a lot of little references here and there to the Wizard of Oz. And there was some, as I remember, Rumpelstiltskin figured in the book. We decided to dump those because they would seem a little obvious. Instead of looking for symbols to understand who this man was and what America was like, I decided to turn to genre in American cinema. Some of it's gangsters, like when the two men, heavies, come to throw Farnsworth out of the window. There are other scenes which are just depression scenes, if you like, which would have come from films of the 30s. So I turned to the cinema for reference rather than literature, although there are literary references. For example, the house where Newton installs himself was by a lake, and we had a jetty. And I had assumed that this man was another Gatsby. We wouldn't have a green light, but we'd have a more spacey blue light, which revolves as he remembers life on his planet. I used certain American icons of the time. Rip Torn, for example, looks like a sort of cowboy, so we put him in a hat with the sort of walk as if he'd just gotten off a horse. So that it was immediately part of the West. When we moved the film to New Mexico, it was originally set in Kentucky. That also gave us other elements, like science fiction elements, because there are more sightings of creatures from space and spaceships and so forth in New Mexico than the whole of the world put together. And then there were other things. For example, in the scene where Newton, locks himself in the bathroom because he can't stand being human anymore, and he wants to show Mary Lou that he is in fact an alien, which she of course doesn't know. She says, Tommy? Tommy? He doesn't answer. She says, can you hear me? And that I had put in because it related to The Who and to Ken Russell. So it's Tommy, can you hear me? So there were references of all kinds. And I thought, even if they're not grasped, it doesn't really matter. It'll create a non-literary series of connections in the end, associations. So we were always looking for what Baudelaire would call correspondance, connections which were image connections rather than plot connections. We substituted images which developed the characters and their predicament and their feelings rather than plot to drive the story forward. In the book, Tevis quotes the poem of W.H. Auden about the fall of Icarus, and it refers to Bruegel's painting, which is in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. The significance of the painting, for the film anyway, was that no one noticed the fall. That was the thing. What is brilliant in the painting, and which Auden observed, of course, which is the basis of the poem, was that if you look at the painting and it's called The Fall of Icarus, you can't find Icarus in it. But if you look in the lower right-hand corner, there's a little figure splashing into a lake. Now, the idea that no one saw him, because they're all going about their business, they've got other things to think about, intrigued us. And we created a character, a mysterious figure on top of the coal slag heap, who is just watching him. And he says later, Newton, nobody saw me fall, nobody saw me arrive, but someone did. He doesn't appear again until the very end, when Newton is incarcerated. This figure appears at the end of the bed. The man, incidentally, has a beard now, which he didn't have at the beginning. So he is real in some strange way, because while Newton doesn't grow old, this curious figure has grown old like everybody else. Who is this man? He is the watcher, and in my view, the author of the piece. And he has been watching Newton all along. I had no knowledge of Walter Tevis's life, apart from the fact that drink was a problem, that he was an English professor in Athens, Ohio, that he had played pool, and that he was a chess player. However, I did know The Hustler. And The Hustler on the surface doesn't seem much to do with The Man Who Fell to Earth. But in my view, it's very close. American society loves a winner. It will not tolerate a loser, someone who does not achieve his aim. There's a line in the book of The Hustler where Eddie hears deep inside him a voice saying, you don't have to be a winner. Tevis's view was being the best was more important than winning. Now, there is an element of that, strong element of that, in The Man Who Fell to Earth. Here we have a guy who is far superior to the people around him, intellectually and scientifically and so forth. Nonetheless, he loses. And I think Tevis's point is that if you have exceptional talents, the world will get you. If you are not a success to go with the genius. Being a genius is no good unless you also win. The other aspect from The Hustler is the idea, obviously, of drunkenness. Now, the Piper Laurie character in the movie is an alcoholic, a sort of intellectual alcoholic, writing a book, sort of a diary. Into her life comes an uneducated bum, Eddie Felsen, but he's a genius at pool. In The Man Who Fell to Earth, we have an alcoholic genius, Thomas Jerome Newton, who comes into the life of a completely ill-educated girl who doesn't understand really what he's talking about. He comes to Earth because his planet is dry. The first thing he does is find water. Everywhere he goes, you see water. He never goes anywhere but there isn't a fountain or a water in the background. Newton is already a drinker before he lands. So when he meets this chambermaid, and she's kind of likes a drink, he says, I want a drink. And she says, a gin? He said, no, water's fine. Everybody drinks. Without water, there would be no life on the planet. So we clung to water completely. Even when Rip Torn has betrayed Newton,
Help me, Nate.
he can't stand the cries, Nate, help me. And he turns his back on him and stops by a water fountain and has a drink.
Help me, Nate.
It's not just alcohol, it's the essence of life, really. In the book, the character of Dr. Bryce is a kind of detective figure. He sets out to find out the mystery of this Newton guy. We kept that in the film, but he never betrays him in a direct sense. He takes his woman. That's the betrayal. It is Mary Lou who betrays him in our story by taking money. The point is, everybody betrays Newton. Because when you have that ability and have that power, everybody wants something from you. And no matter who they are and for whatever reason, they want a piece when they realize it's money. Because it's all about, in the end, it's all about money. And when the government agency comes to throw Buck Henry out of the window, it's only because he's got too much control of his company. The government wants the control of the finances. And what interested us was the idea that there is no division between business and politics. And I think we were quite prescient about that it was one company taking over another company. The fact that this company was called the state is immaterial. It's a company. As far as the characterization in the script went, we had two characters, and we had an idea for who those characters would be if we got to make the film. Farnsworth would be maybe James Mason. Dr. Bryce may be James Coburn. Now, I don't know how far Nick eventually got with that, but we certainly couldn't afford either James Mason or James Coburn. And so when Buck Henry was cast as Farnsworth, of course, it's a different character in a way from what I'd written. So I lightened it so that he was very fleet, dancerish in his dialogue, more ironic, perhaps, than a James Mason sort of character would be. When it came to Nathan Bryce, Rip Torn was, of course, a completely new idea. Brilliant actor. But here was a tense, voluble kind of man. This meant that the smooth operator that I had sort of envisaged, who's worming his way into the company slickly, of course couldn't be. Before, he was a kind of playboy, fooling around with girls on campus. a coxswain, but smooth. With Rip, of course, you get a completely different character. And so I began to change the lines a little bit. Mostly it was in Nick's direction of Rip that the changes were. The thing that interests me about David Bowie, apart from that he looks like a possible alien, and we really had trouble thinking about who that might be, was that he's quite a good mime artist. The walk and the general movements of this character would be something that David might manage better than a card-carrying conventional actor. Nick is always drawn to performers rather than actors. So that's why Art Garfunkel, I think, is in Bad Timing, which is a rather strange piece of casting on the surface, but he likes that. He thinks that performers can hold audiences and they have more, there's more in them, in a way. They're not just reading the lines. I would say that there is absolutely no difference for David Bowie between on stage a massive light show like the Spiders from Mars tour, Aladdin Sane, and appearing in a hotel room as an alien. Bowie didn't have to bring his performance down. This was David Bowie. He could lie there asleep and be wonderful. A man like him doesn't think about bringing things down or taking things up. He just is. It doesn't matter where he is or what he is. The thing is, he's just got it. It's a magnetic personality and a magnetic look. The camera loves him, as they used to say. And he doesn't have to do anything. He just sits there. One of the things we changed, well, developed really from the book, was his relationship with Mary Lou, or Betty Jo, as she was called in the novel. We thought, why would anyone come to Earth, a man who fell to Earth, and not want to pick up girls? Of course he wants a girl. Why not? But he doesn't know what they are. So the first one he comes across is a very old woman. And I had written that as a man. And Nick said, no, no. The dialogue's the same. But the first man he meets on Earth is a woman. He doesn't know the difference. So it's a voyage of discovery. In the book, the relationship between Newton and Mary Lou was essentially platonic. That would maybe work for him. Aliens don't know anything about sex on Earth. But it's not going to work for Mary Lou, because she sure as hell knows what it is. So we decided that not only emotional but sexual relations were important. And it's certainly something that Nick was particularly interested in, exploring sexual relationships because they present a danger. In other words, if you don't touch anybody, you'll be fine. The minute you touch and go further, then danger begins. Sex is another alcohol. Once you start, it's very hard to stop. You get used to it. You want it. And she is very sexually driven, and he doesn't know what it is to begin with. And those scenes are really quite interesting. However, what's important about that is that while he's rather delicate and careful and not knowing quite what to do, the guy in Chicago is hammering away at ladies all day and all night in a most violent sexual manner. Aggressive sexuality appalls Newton. He doesn't know what that is. With the Japanese element into which these scenes are cut. And I introduced that idea because I've always been very keen on Japanese culture since school days and saw the first films of Kurosawa and Ozu. The characteristic of Japanese society is that there is part of it that is incredibly contemplative and quiet and spiritual even. And there's another part that is bloodletting perversion. And I wanted to have that comparison because it defined for me two kinds of love. And it struck me that this curious coexistence of attitudes to the flesh and the spirit was perfect for our film. I think that what Candy Clark did brilliantly were the changes from scene to scene. In other words, she never really understands Newton, but the closer she gets to him, the more allowances she makes for him. and she tries to please him, and she's kind of got a simple mind about that. She doesn't want a life of her own, and I think that's what possibly irritated audiences and certainly critics in the United States. Women are supposed to want a life of their own and so forth, and why is she content to stay the way she is? And my feeling was, this is not a social drama where she can improve her life. She goes from rags to riches in a very short space of time. What's to do? What should she do? Find a life? Get a life? I mean, she's got a life. She's living with an alien, for Christ's sake. That beats most women's lives, doesn't it? And then, of course, she becomes corrupted, partly by the money, but partly by the fact that there is a limit to the contact she can have with this man. I think I imagined Jean Peters, actually, when I wrote the character. I used to watch Jean Peters movies when I was at school. I mean, you know, Three Coins in the Fountain and so forth. Really good films like Pick Up on South Street. Now, in Pick Up on South Street, she is a street kid, you know, involved with some dodgy people and so on. Now, we know that she wasn't the girl on the subway, really, but I see the girl on the subway and then I find out she's married to Howard Hughes. So I put the two things together. What would they do together? I mean, what possible life could Jean Peters in Pick Up on South Street have with Howard Hughes, the aviator and owner of RKO? And that's how I began to think of it. I think they would both play ping pong, table tennis. He's very thin, Howard Hughes, and when younger, you know, he'd be very nimble. He might be a rather good ping pong player. So they'd be in this place somewhere, basement or on top of a roof of a vast hotel, playing ping pong, the two of them, until they got exhausted, you know. And I thought that was an image I had for Jean Peters, so I transferred it. Simple as that. We wanted to introduce an ESP aspect. Apart from the fact we're both interested in it, Nick and I, it also is a way of getting over certain problems. For example, in the relationship between Bryce and Newton, in the book, you have one man who is following another as a kind of detective. In the movie, what we did, Newton is way ahead of him. He knows he's wandering. So we undercut this idea, oh, it's a detective story, he's going to be discovered. Newton knows he's going to be discovered. And he keeps saying to Bryce, don't be suspicious, don't be afraid. He's trying to make him more of a spiritual person. The story is what the other people do, not knowing and not being able to cope with the fact that this is a man who knows everything ahead of time. He doesn't care that his best friend is sleeping with his lady. They will. What can you do? Everybody wants a piece of me. It doesn't matter, as long as there's another drink. Even to the point of going home. That's why we took out the whole notion from the book of why he wanted to go home, back. I wanted him just to go home and see what he knew already, that his family were dead. He knows that. Now, whether they died at the moment in the story we see them, it doesn't really matter. Maybe they were dead already before the thing started and he got off the planet. I don't think we ever thought of doing the piece as a chronological narrative. It's not a question of flashback and what time was it and when was it. They are parallels. Scenes mirror each other in images and in the performances and so forth. And because Newton stays the same throughout, you can't possibly tell, if you are with him, what year it is, because it doesn't mean anything to him, because he's moving at a different so-called chronological time continuum. So why bother with it? The one nod to chronological time is to show the other characters grow older. What bothers us about time anyway, apart from being on time or... The thing is, what it means is you're a day nearer to your death. That's about what it comes down to. That's why we're so interested in time. Newton is not a day nearer his death. He's not afraid of that. And you will find why mystics and spiritual people, or even soldiers, are not interested in time, because they're not concerned about getting nearer to their death. And it's a really different way of thinking. I'm told that the film doesn't date today. I can't judge that because it's so fresh in my mind that it'll never date. It's like a first love. But I think one reason is because of what we dumped from Tevis's book. Had we had the political associations and stories and so forth that the book and the nuclear war and all of those things and the creatures from space and so on, which Spielberg has done so much better, and I think that would have dated it. It was precisely the things we left out that keeps it fresh.